been drawn to the more creative aspects of what the technology brings. And it was quite interesting to hear Francois's take, and I've had the opportunity to look through his book. I know he's looked through my book a little bit, and it seems like what's really nice is I think we approach this stuff through somewhat different experiences, but we've arrived at sort of the same place, and so that's I think that's a really great thing.
Which seems to me to be that we're really interested in looking at BIM as a design environment or a design tool rather than for production strictly.
Sure. Yeah, I would say that, obviously the production and the management capabilities are an added bonus. And I think that that is still something that drives a lot of the population to BIM systems. But I think we would be amiss as architects and designers to not really reconceptualize the power of the BIM systems themselves in terms of generative design, in terms of really allowing for simulation and testing right at the outset of a preliminary design problem to really drive a process forward. Speaking particularly in my book, a lot of the practices that I included, I specifically looked for examples that really illustrated that point across a variety of scales.
And that's where the mainstream conversation of BIM isn't going, because it's really about at best construction documentation and in large part during construction. And that is important because without those benefits, then we can't really pay for the good stuff.
Right.
But the good stuff gets missed in that conversation, which is being able to take the inherent quantitative information that's in the building model and analyze it, examine it, and use that to make better qualitative decisions as architects.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would say one of the most interesting things, if you track how BIM has influenced design practice, and the break is basically right at the end of the 20th century. Architects for the last 400 or so years have really been marginalized. And the point is that we, when we were working in 2D environments, whether they were manual or CAD environments, we would produce a set of documents, and at the end of construction documentation, hand them off to others to interpret with sometimes minimal or no impact in the project beyond that sort of point. And I think one of the things that BIM systems really do is really expand the kind of territory, the design territory that architects work in. So there's no longer a hard stop at the time documents are tendered. We now have an opportunity to engage technical consultants in a far more robust way. We can talk to subcontractors and share data with them in real time to lead to digital fabrication, those kinds of things. So I think the important thing here is, sure, there's efficiency, but really BIM for me is about expanding the design territory within which we operate.
Kind of taking back some lost ground.
Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned in your book is just how few sheets used to be required for documenting buildings, and certainly there's been a trend towards protecting architects' liabilities. And so ironically, we're drawing more than we used to, but at the same time we've sacrificed a lot of the design control. And so more drawings, and yet in a way less design. And one of the, I don't know if it's a problem or not, but one of the issues in our profession is that we're very, very concerned about controlling and mitigating risk.
Sure.
And that's the responsible thing to do, but there's a price for that. And the price is that we've lost some design control. Whereas the large construction companies that are sort of taking on architecture studios as part of their sort of business model are designed to be not risk averse. They couldn't be building buildings if they were that risk averse.
Right. Well, and I think that model, which is one I'm a little bit suspicious of, to be honest with you, where general contracting firms are adopting BIM systems as a way to sort of check the architect's work or value engineer it before it comes time to actually go to construction. And one of the arguments that I make in the book that I like very much is that when you look at that 20th century model of practice, it's something that we started calling the possible to the real, in that architects would draw on 2D sheets a possibility that was given to others to potentially make real. But because of interpretation, the real maybe never got real or something like that. And I think with BIM, the paradigm has shifted to what we call the virtual to actual.
Right.
So the idea is that the building is fully constructed virtually within the computer. And then there's creative ways, I think, that we can then transmit the data to actualize the building. So what that does is it keeps a lot more responsibility on the design team as opposed to the contractor. The contractor obviously needs to be involved in that, but it also completely undoes any kind of possibility of interpretation or misinterpretation, as it turns out in the previous paradigm.
So, boy, we could have a whole another conversation about like where the notion of craft, right, which was a big sort of 20th century preoccupation.
Yeah.
Probably because, we were watching it sort of evaporate.
Right.
Where craft sort of fits in all of that, and along with all that, I think even before we get to the point of in the design process of digital fabrication or contemplating that, even at the conceptual stage, there's a lot of room for building information modeling.
Yeah.
And the longer I've practiced and the more technology has sort of expanded along the way, the line between schematic design and design development, which was always a little blurry at best, has gotten, if anything, even blurrier.
Yeah,
and now,
invisible.
DD to CDs is just, well, today we're just renaming the file the CD file, but it's really almost exactly like yesterday's DD file, and we just keep going. And so it's really one long, fluid gesture from sort of the seminal inception of the project all the way to let's see what the router is spitting out.
Right. Well, and I would say that there was a very productive moment, probably in the late 90s, early 2000s, where there were a lot of digitally minded people that got into this sort of pre-BIM, if you will, through digital fabrication, installation design, exhibition design, temporary kinds of things where architects were designing things that were geometrically optimistic, say, and they had to find ways to build them, to get them fabricated. So I think there was a natural progression from those kinds of folks who were really engaged in digital fabrication and seeing what routers and laser cutters and those kinds of things could do, to graduating up as the tools have gotten more sophisticated to more complex and more challenging kind of building projects that still have fabrication sorts of challenges, but all sorts of other challenges that BIM systems can help manage as well.
And since we're talking about design, that I think that raises sort of the interesting question of, where does the designer end and where does the tool begin?
Yeah.
I have to admit, I get a little impatient when I hear people say, well, BIM, fine, it's just a tool,
right?
And I'm going to do my design work, and BIM is just a tool. So, if you think that BIM is just a tool, try designing an international style building with a piece of charcoal and plaster models. Right? That's just the tool. Very, very strongly influences the kind of work that you do. Right?
Yeah,
that's why we have different kinds of tools, because we want to have different outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And by saying it's just a tool, what you've done is you've closed off any kind of introspection or self-critical thinking or examination of what is this tool leading me to. You're just kind of blindly following along.
Yeah.
And I think that's a critique of BIM in particular, or the emerging technology in general, is that people aren't being thoughtful about it.
Yeah.
And I think from different avenues, both of us are asking designers to be thoughtful and take responsibility for the power that we have, and apply it.
Yeah, and I would say part of the idea of really kind of digesting, if you will, the new suite of tools that BIM provides is really redefining the architect's role as an author. And authorship for me doesn't only mean like the total control of the process driving it forward. It means kind of understanding how to control it and drive it in a certain direction. Sometimes you have to push a little bit harder to get it to go your way, and sometimes you can be a little bit more sort of hands-off. And so one example that I would say is in the world where there are multiple owners of the data, of the models, you can have an architect, you can have a series of engineering consultants, you can have a subcontractor, you can even have a GC. I think one of the important things is to kind of understand parametrically where that ownership, where that intent lies. And so, I would say if we're talking about a geometrically complex project, for instance, that, the architect would own the curves, literally the curves in the model, and the kind of information that gets built up on those curves are parametrically constrained to those curves. Mm-hmm. And therefore, everyone is sort of responding to the original intent by the architect. And I think that's a very literal way that this kind of expanded territory of design can actually happen. Other people may be doing the work, but they're referring to your model, your curves that's really carrying through to a high level through the project.
When we talk about collaboration between the different sort of design and construction stakeholders, that sort of assumes, and we sort of figure out and negotiate who's got what part of the model.
Yeah.
That assumes that there's already a somewhat robust model there. But at the very early stages, before the consultants, really get deep into it, they might be helping to identify the problem. But, at a certain point, the architect's authorship is literally authorship, right? Not just the conductor, right? You're shape making.
Sure.
And for me, that's where I find, particularly on the smaller scale projects that I tend to work on, where environment and climate have a huge impact on energy footprint, that using the data of BIM to help drive the form of the project towards a better, deeper climate indexing and responsiveness is helpful.
Yeah.
And that is an exploratory phase. That's not just a matter of, I'm going to pull down this column tool and I either get a 6, 8, 10, or 12-inch column, depending on what the software designer's, right? It's a free-form modeling process.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that, to put it quickly in an academic context, a colleague of mine, we were having a discussion about our undergraduates, and he said, well, the funny thing is undergraduates, especially at the first and second year, they know a lot about the M, but they know nothing about the BI. and that really struck me in terms of, what kind of information, especially at the sort of initial levels of architectural education, these tools really have for our students. And you hit it right on. I mean, I think that students, even when they're 18, 19 years old, can easily begin making connections between siting, environmental capacity, shadow casting, solar gain, and the shape of a building. And I think that that's where authorship, whether it's in school or in the beginning phases of a project, really is the most robust territory for us as architects. I also think because we have all of this data at our hands, that's where authorship really becomes novel for me, where it may be that non-standard shapes, non-standard grammars really end up being the best solution or a better solution than say something more standard. And then I think we have the opportunity through the tools to begin justifying the efficiencies of that shape.
Right.
Whereas in another time, someone may look at that and either say, can't do it, too much time, whatever. We really, so I think this kind of justification through understanding the data is an important aspect of what we do, especially in schematic times when we're, our first impulse of design is really occurring.
Yeah, and it is kind of a sort of a circular, recursive, iterative problem because, you notice that they're not called building data models. Well, that would make a good word anyway, but they're building information models. Yeah. And information implies not just raw data, but data that's organized in some way that's human readable and that can be appreciated by the designer.
Yeah.
And so in a funny sort of way, you have to know what you're looking for before you can start finding it, right?
Absolutely.
You have to know that it's not just the ratio of the total glass to the footprint that I care about, but I'm especially concerned about south-facing glass compared to, interior masonry mass, for example.
Right.
And that requires some experience or some training or some education.
Right. Yeah, and I would say also, just to talk about the process, I mean, I think, one could say that the process of going to design through construction to completing a building is still a linear process. Contractually, we have...
Hopefully.
Right. But I think the interesting thing to keep in mind is because of the parametric capabilities of BIM systems, you can always loop back. So you can get farther down the process, realize there's an issue, and loop back without losing the kind of time that one would lose via a more manual and traditional process. And I think that's the kind of buy-in that probably needs to happen more with the consultants and others that architects work with in terms of the design of buildings. And I think that buy-in is very important in terms of making a project successful.
Yeah, and I think that capability to loop back really dovetails nicely with your kind of distinguishing the virtual building versus the possible building. That when you have a robust model that you really understand, then it is virtual. You actually are building it in the computer,
Yeah.
and so you can make mistakes and correct them.
Yeah.
And as opposed to doing it in the field, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And I think that's also one of the important buy-ins is, when you're explaining to a client or a GC or someone like that, oh, and we're going to use this system and it's going to make things more efficient and it's going to allow us to make better decisions. But I think the other side of that, which again is sort of where we started this discussion, is it allows us to do sort of more interesting stuff, right? And that for me, that kind of basis of being an author doing creative things as opposed to rote things is really where it's at. And I think why I and others I know, and you as well, have really gravitated toward these kinds of systems, again, to augment the territory that we take up as opposed to allowing it to constrain us.
Yeah, and it's great that you just use the word constraint, right? Because actually we need constraints, right, as designers. And what I think BIM is giving us an opportunity to do is to come face to face with those constraints and really own up to them.
Yeah.
Whether they're the constraints of fabrication or the constraints of installation or the constraints of site.
Yep.
Having that much modeling and being able to query it for information gives us an opportunity to have those constraints and dance with them instead of just avoiding them or kind of try to, we really get to engage them.
And I would say, so to speak about, a specific example, let's say that you're constrained. We were working on a modular project, which we include in the book. And so we very early in the process constrained the actual size of the module, knowing trucking and logistics and all that sort of stuff. And, so once our model got shared in the world with other technical consultants, we would see exactly where pieces of timber, pieces of steel, these kinds of things would actually break the volume, the boundary of that constraint. And so it's a really nice example of seeing how something that could be set to drive a more pure authorial process at the beginning really feeds through to allow us to make sound decisions about, say, a structural system, all within the kind of framework of shipping a module to a site or something like that. And I think those are the kinds of stories that really give a lot of credibility to the engagement with these tools, right? I mean, at the end of the day, sure, we want to go at this as authors, but I think it's also important to remember there's something in it for everyone that we engage in this process.
Right. That's the paradox, is that we have greater authorship, right? And at the same time, we have to be more collaborative with everyone else.
Absolutely.
Because we've stuck our heads out and we've modeled everything. So
Absolutely.
we've got to get feedback from the trades or other designers who are expert in their fields. And so at the same time, we have more authorship and possibly just a little less ego and more sort of collaboration and playing together.
Yeah. And that's, again, once the model goes out into the world and other people start working on it and working with it, that's where control ceases to be this kind of top-down thing that I think architects of another era would really want, and really becomes how you can collaborate productively with the team, sometimes nudging it along in a direction if you want it to go a certain way, but ultimately moving forward with the confidence that the early decisions, the design intent that's embedded in the model, that kind of intelligence really sort of guides the process quite a bit.
I like what you say and alluded to in our earlier discussion about the architect having sort of authorship, when the model is mature, of the guides, of the datum.
Yeah.
So, the Greek root of our profession, the word, that arc, is from archon, which, means a ruler.
Yeah.
So one way of looking at a ruler is this top-down, that kind of ruler. But another way of playing with the word ruler is sort of the measure, right, and the spacing. And so we could be that kind of ruler for the project team, and kind of get what we want, and everybody gets what they want.
And I would say one of the important things, and I'm sure you do this in your own work, one of the important things that we have to establish on the outset of every project is a sort of system of measure. Mm-hmm. And that might be a literal system of measure in terms of dimensions and those kinds of constraints, but a system of measure in terms of managing different kinds of volumes or areas of space. All of these kinds of things are far more accessible at the outset of a problem if you set up your model properly to kind of engage those kinds of things. And I think, the amount of data that you can put into this from the outset is, compared to, say, a 20th century model of practice, I mean, it doesn't even compute. I mean, there's so much more that we can kind of embed in. And I think that just puts us in a far better position in the long view of a project, So again, it's really, to go back to that concept of expanding the territory of design, I feel like that's such an important concept that people that are thinking about adopting BIM systems or beginning to use BIM systems really need to understand.